Go for it.
Good evening, everyone. This is the session we've been waiting for. Without further delay, let me introduce you all to our speaker today. William Dralimpul, one of Britain's great historians and best-selling authors, is here with us for this virtual session. In 2018, William was present with the prestigious President's Medal by the British Academy for his outstanding literary achievement and for co-founding the Jaipur Literature Festival. Thank you for taking out your time to join us for this session titled The Company Quartet, An Extraordinary Story. Stay with us because we are about to experience a very informative session that will revolve around William Dalrymple's book, The Anarchy, White Mughals, Return of a King and the Last Mughal, bringing together 2 decades of meticulous research and masterful narration. This book tells the remarkable story of how the Mughal Empire, which then generated just under half the world's wealth, disintegrated and came to be replaced by the first global corporate power, the East India Company. I would like to ask our audience to grab this opportunity to be a part of the live session and put down their questions in the comment section below. Over to William.
Thank you very much, Nita. Well, I've got a 20 years work to somehow compress now into a 1-hour lecture. This is the first time I've tried to give all 4 of these books together as a Zoom call, but let's see how we go. Could we share the screen, please, Nita, and have the first slide if possible? And here we are. Here is the first slide, and it is the, whoops, it disappeared. Go back again. It was there. There we go, exactly. So this is the Company Quartet. I'm holding a copy of it here that is a very good alternative to going to the gym. You can just move it left, right, and center, and it will be all the fitness you ever need. It is a weighty thing because it is 20 years work. And I feel vindicated because when I began work on the first of these volumes in 1999, neither colonialism nor big corporations were part of the news. I think both are very much at the center of things today. And the Company Quartet speaks to the present in 2 ways. First of all, I think everyone has woken up to the extraordinary importance of understanding colonial history. And the success of books such as Shashi Tharoor's Inglorious Empire, and in Britain, Satnam Sanghera's extraordinary book Empire Land, has taken to center stage the story of the colonial presence in India, but particularly I think the importance of understanding the East India Company, which was the organ for the initial conquest of India, because it was not the British Crown, but a corporation which organized the initial conquest and then the looting and drain of wealth that the East India Company oversaw. And the second aspect of the story, the fact that it is a corporate story, is of course something that very much, again, speaks to the present. We've woken up in the last few years to the ability of large corporations to undermine and take over nation states that are insufficiently protected against them. The great corporations of the present, Facebook, Google, ExxonMobil, and so on, have wealth which is far greater than that of the wealth of many nation states. A company like Tesla or Amazon disposes far greater annual turnovers than the GDPs of most nation states. And they are in many ways stronger than many nation states and can overcome nation states. Now, this is something which India, and particularly perhaps Bengal, which is why it's particularly good to do this story in Calcutta, was the first to experience, because the East India Company focused first of all on Bengal and Calcutta as its initial conquest. And it was out of Calcutta and run from from Raj Bhavan in Calcutta that the conquest of the rest of India by a corporation for profit took place. Now, the key for me writing these books was my partnership. If we move forward 2 slides, Nita, on the PowerPoint, please. This is the first and the second. This is my long-term professional partner and collaborator, Bruce Swanell, who very tragically died 2 years ago, soon after the publication of The Anarchy. And Bruce brought to the table an extraordinary facility with language. He was completely, perfectly fluent in Persian, but also in Urdu, Hindi, almost all European languages, Pushtun, Turkish, Arabic, and therefore was in a very good position to read. We have next slide, not only the epigraphy and inscriptions, next slide, please, of monuments and tombstones across the Persianate world. Next slide, I think, also has Bruce on the side of I think in Herat. Next slide, please. Can we be a bit quicker moving the slides on when the command comes, because it'll just slow everything down. Here is Bruce working on the inscriptions in Herat. He worked for a long time with the Aga Khan Foundation, making a register of all the Persianate inscriptions in Afghanistan. But anyway, he came along into the project and over the course of 20 years translated large numbers of previously unused Mughal texts that I pulled out of the National Archives, out of various repositories such as the extraordinary library at Tonk in Rajasthan, also particularly the British Library in London. And what we discovered was that there are vast numbers of extremely strong narrative histories of this period that have simply never been translated again. Biographies, histories, and in the case of the final volume of the Company Quartet, which was the last Mughal, which takes the story up to 1857, the story also of the extraordinary story of the Mutiny Papers, which are about 30,000 pieces of paper from the rebel camp in 1857, which lie in the National Archives in Delhi, and which up to that point had never been used for a history of 1857 in English, which was one of the major coups. And Bruce worked on all these different materials and did an extraordinary job over the course of his 20 years. And as I say, I feel really very bereft now without him. I've lost my key to the cupboard, letting me into the Narnia of late Mughal history. And so this volume very much stands as a monument to Bruce's labors of translation, and the whole 4 books are dedicated to him. So the first, to start off, not in the order that I wrote the books, but the order of the story they tell. The Anarchy, the most recent of the books to come out, but the book which tells the beginning of the story. Next slide, please. The Anarchy opens not in Calcutta or in India, but in this very English-looking castle on the Anglo-Welsh border. And it couldn't be more English-looking. There are Tudor box hedges and gorgeous Elizabethan crenellations, but inside, it's a different story. Next slide, please. Because here you have the great gallery of Powys, containing much of the loot that Robert Clive took from Murshidabad, from the court of Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and after him that his daughter purchased from those who had looted Srirangapatnam, the capital of Tipu Sultan. And it is, in a sense, the greatest repository of loot obviously being a Hindustani word that only made it into English in the 18th century, in private hands. So what is it is here? Next slide. An extraordinary array of treasures: elephant, armor, chess pieces, talwars, helmets, armor, and even, we're looking through here, Siraj-ud-Dowlah's palanquin. abandoned on the battlefield of Plassey and now sitting unexpectedly on the Anglo-Welsh marches, still the property of Clive's descendants. Next slide. And leading the way into the gallery where all this loot still remains is a picture which tells the story of how it happened. It's not a very good picture. Benjamin West had never been to India, and his imagined idea of the conveying of what he calls the gift of the Diwani is neither historically accurate in terms of buildings and the general setup here, because this in fact took place privately in the tent of Shah Alam after the Battle of Buxar, when the defeated Mughal emperor had no other option. In the tent of Shah Alam in Allahabad Fort, when the defeated Mughal emperor had no option but to sign the document handed to him by Clive. And it is Clive, the slightly portly figure in the red coat on the left, who is receiving the document from Shah Alam. And in this this picture covers up the reality that it was entirely by force that the three richest kingdoms of the Mughal Empire we got slightly erratic slide changing here. Can we go back to that picture, because I'm still talking about it? Whoever's running the slides, could we keep attention, please? So the picture of the Diwani tells the story of how the three richest provinces of India were forcibly taken from the Mughal Empire and handed over to the East India Company in the Treaty of Alibaba in the aftermath of the Battle of Buxar. And the entity to which it was handed was not the British government operating out of Downing Street and operating out of the Foreign Office or the Colonial Office, because no such thing existed at that stage, but instead was a private company that existed in this small building in the slide in front of us, just 5 windows wide, slightly offset from the street. It's not even the 2 buildings on either side of the slide. It's just the 5 buildings in the middle. And for a long time, this was the entire extent of the East India headquarters. For a century after its founding, it had only 35 staff. At the time of the Battle of Plassey, there were only 250 white East India Company employees in India. And yet this skeleton staff pulled off the extraordinary trick of borrowing money largely from Indian bankers, and it was Indian bankers that propelled Clive towards Plassey to take on Siraj Dowlah. It was the Jagat Sets based in Murshidabad who paid him to do it, and thereafter continued to keep the East India Company in business. And it used not white British military labor, but very largely Indian sepoys who they hired as mercenaries. And so you have this extraordinary trick, unimaginable in the present day, of a very small English company with a small headquarters in a private office block in the city of London, using the credit facilities of Indian bankers to hire Indian mercenaries to attack other Indian troops and to conquer the Indian subcontinent. It's the most extraordinary bit of history. And the more closely you look at it, the more surprising it becomes. Calcutta was in the 1750s, rather like Dubai or Singapore today, in the sense it was a tax haven. If you moved there, if you were a Marwari banker and you moved to Calcutta, you were not subject to the taxation of the Murshidabad Nawabs or the Mughal Empire. And so many Marwaris headed there, and they saw, for better or worse, whether one agrees with it or not, better prospects for their businesses and their families supporting the company than they did supporting the Mughal Empire. And it was that fatal alliance of Indian moneylenders and British and European military technology derived from the military developments of Frederick the Great, who had invented a new type of warfare in the 7-Year War in mid-18th century Europe, that transformed India over the next few years. Next slide. Could we have that? So this is where the company begins. 1616, Sir Thomas Smythe, who runs the customs and is one of the main accountants in London, decides to found a company, Dutch, who have just proved that you could sail very easily from Europe round the Horn of Africa, through past the Cape, and buy spices directly, not from India, but from the East Indies, which means in modern parlance, Indonesia. And the Dutch base was set up at Batavia, which is modern Jakarta. And it was from Indonesia that the Dutch East India Company began sending spices at huge profits back to Europe, cutting out Arab middlemen and then also the Venetians and all those in southern Europe who'd been part of the spice trade. The Brits wanted a bit of the action, so they sent out an expedition. They founded the company in 1599, next slide, and we still have the original subscription list. Here it is. And you can see the names of all the people who've subscribed to the company. You see the first guy at the top, the Mayor of London, has given £200. And then Captain John Smart and George Bontes, I think, have given 1,000, and so on and so forth. And on it goes. The rich and the wealthy give 1,000, 200, 400, and so on. Then you have people who describe themselves as vintners or haberdashers or so on, who give just 10 or 20 pounds. And what was crucial about the East India Company was it was the first joint stock company. Up to then, if you wanted to be in a business, you had to be part of the business. You had to be employed as a businessman, as was the case, for example, with the medieval guilds. They would club together to buy raw materials and so on, but they operated only as a business, often on a family basis. So the Medici Bank or the Marco Polo Company was a family business. But the joint stock corporation was something completely different, a different beast. It allowed other people who had no part in the business other than investing their money to reap the profits. And this model allowed the East India Company to a huge access to funds and to wealth, which it used with incredible effect to become the largest business in the world and the source of about half of British imports and exports within 150 years. Next slide. They built the first property for the East India Company headquarters in Leadenhall Street. It looks a bit like a Tudor pub that you still see in some provincial towns. And from this small wooden building, a network of trade spread out. Initially, the East Indies, but after the Dutch basically won the competition between the British, or rather the English and the Dutch, for command of Indonesian spice trade, the Company of London merchants trading to the East Indies, as the East India Company was originally known, refocused in the 1640s on India, because India was in the middle of an extraordinary moment of transformation, and under the Mughals had become the world's largest manufacturer of textiles. When we think of the Mughals today with Bollywood, we think of Shah Jahan dropping mango slices into Nur Jahan's mouth or whatever it is, or Mumtaz Mahal's mouth. But it all rested on the back of an enormous expansion of the export trade, and particularly textiles, and particularly out of Bengal. And it was this that brought the East India Company to Bengal in the first place, and it was this that slowly led to the growth of Calcutta, till it was far larger than the rival Mughal settlement of Hooghly and the other Dutch, Danish, and French ports on the river. Next slide. But the moment that really distinguished it, of course, was the Battle of Plassey, when Siraj Dowlah took Calcutta, but did so with fantastically bad timing, because next slide, at the same time as as news arrived of the fall of Calcutta, next slide, please, that Calcutta had fallen to Siraj Dowlah, a task force had just arrived in Madras, a flotilla of ships led by this man, and this is Robert Clive. He hadn't come to take on Siraj Dowlah because they had no idea there was a threat to Calcutta when they left Britain. What they'd come to do was they'd come to see off a French force, which they imagined had sailed to Bengal. In fact, it had sailed to America. So rather like the Iraq War, the entire background to the Battle of Plassey was an intelligence failure. by the East India Company. They believed that the French had sent a massive fleet and were going to attack the British at Calcutta and in somewhere in India. It was a falsehood, but it turned out to be a lucky break because this allowed Clive to prove his mettle. He went up to Bengal, he retook Calcutta, and then he receives a message from Murshidabad from the Jagat Sets offering him £1 million if he will take Siraj-ud-Dowlah out. And he doesn't check with anyone in England, he just goes ahead and he does it. Famously, after defeating, next slide, Siraj-ud-Dowlah at the Battle of Plassey, he goes to Murshidabad and just goes into the Murshidabad treasury, at the end of which he declares that my lords, he says to the House of Lords, I was astonished at my own moderation. He took only £1 million, which in those days was enough to make him the richest self-made man in Europe. The entire contents of the Murshidabad treasury is then punted down the river to Calcutta and shoved into the vaults of Fort William. Next slide. Over the next decade, another great battle is fought at Buxar, where the East India Company defeats not just the new Nawab of Bengal, but also the Nawab of Awadh and Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and also Shah Alam, the Mughal Emperor. And this gives them Hindustan. Next slide. And by this stage, the sepoy army has grown from a few thousand just before Plassey to 30 or 40,000 by the time of Buxar. And next slide, by the time of 1799, only 40 years after Battle of Plassey, next slide, please, the East India Company army has become the largest professional military force in Asia and is astonishingly double the size of the British Army. It doesn't answer to Downing Street. It answers instead only to the shareholders of the East India Company. And they are interested only in one thing, the maximization of their share value and the profits. And we see this most terribly in the 1770s during the Great Bengal Famine, when possibly a third of the population of Bengal die of starvation. The East India Company does not diminish taxation in the slightest. Instead, they send the sepoys out to the villages to gather taxes. And when the news reaches London that the full taxation has been paid in Bengal, the shareholders at their annual general meeting in London vote for an increase in their share distribution from 10 to 12.5%. And it's, in a sense, the best ever example of sort of corporate heartlessness, that you can just see an area of the globe as somewhere to be exploited for profit, for a corporation. Next slide. After this, the East India Company spreads out across South Asia. In a series of battles, the Marathas are defeated, Tipu Sultan is defeated, and British taxation officers, such as James Todd on this elephant here, ride out around the country, assessing land and beginning to tax it. By the end, you have this model that is brilliant if you are an investor in the East India Company, but disastrous if you are someone under their authority, whereby it's no longer necessary for the East India Company to send money out to India to buy the goods of India, which was the original model. You send money out to India, you buy manufactured cloth of the highest quality, and you sell it around the world. But by the end of the 18th century, the East India Company merely had to tax Indians to make a profit. It then bought the manufactured cloth and all the other goods it wanted to sell, and it then sold them around the globe. The next development, of course, was to plant opium in Bengal and Bihar, to sell it in China for massive profit, turning the East India Company into the largest narco operator in history, to make the Medellin cartel look like child's play. And eventually, next slide, you see this culminating in the sale of that tea bought in China, first in India, then in Europe, and finally in America. And it is East India Company tea that is poured into Boston Harbor at the beginning of the American Revolution. And it is partly fear that the East India Company would be let loose in America in the same way as it had been in Bengal and India that leads to much of the initial opposition and ultimately the entire independence struggle against Britain in America. So the East India Company, by this stage, has turned from a small, creaky, rather ineffective Jacobean trading organization into the world's first multinational corporation, straddling different continents and making vast profits over different parts of the globe, using its private army of 200,000 Indian sepoys. Next slide. It is the East India Company flag that forms part of the basis for the American flag after American independence, with the Union flag removed and the stars added. Next slide. And by this stage, the East India Company has grown from that little Victorian pub that we saw initially, or indeed the mid-18th century 5 windows that we saw after that, to this enormous Palladian edifice that looks a bit like Buckingham Palace. And out of this building, and particularly out of the director's boardroom, is a vast international trading empire. Next slide. Which, like so many subsequent, next slide, please. Like so many other, this is the director's boardroom. Next slide, from which the fate of India was controlled for many years. What Racecourse Road is today, the director's boardroom of the East India Company was in the 18th century. Next slide. And out of that is controlled this vast trading network. Here is the East India Company docks, where all the goods from India and the East India Company dominions, Yemen, Somalia, this whole trading empire, Hormuz, Hong Kong, where they're all brought in. And next slide, even more remarkable. Next slide, please. The Brunswick Docks, where the East India Company clippers are made, this vast network of clippers sailing out around the globe. And of course, the nearest thing there is to this today is one of the great airports of the world, like Heathrow or Delhi Airport, where you have these, jetliners lined up in very similar manner, waiting to go out across the globe. So this is the opening book of the quartet. The second volume, and I will just get out here is the quartet, and the second one just had the Anarchy. The second volume, next slide, is White Moguls, and White Moguls is a micro story. Next slide, which tells a very particular bit of social history that took place at this point. Next slide, please. Here is the cover of White Moguls in the Indian edition. Next slide. Whoever's controlling the slide, can we have a bit quicker reaction? Here is the, not a Mogul Nawab, but that is a Yorkshire chartered accountant, John Wombwell. And White Moguls tells the story. It sort of stops, the narrative of the Anarchy ends around 1800. And this is the time that White Moguls is set, because behind the story of the corporate takeover of India, lies another story of how many Brits fell in love with and were assimilated into late Mughal culture at this time. Next slide. A typical example of an official at this period of the East India Company is David Octalone. Here he is in his official guise. You can see him in his red company waistcoat, his red coat and all his medals. But look what he looks like at home. Next slide. Next slide, please. Here he is in the British residency in Delhi, and you can see he's wearing a sort of Fab India kurta. He's got his dancing girls, he's listening to music, and he's got a eunuch behind him with a fly whisk. It all looks very jolly, a very nice way for a man who famously had no less than 26 Indian wives, each of whom had her own elephant. Every evening they go around the Red Fort and return for an evening of music and entertainment such as this. And here is the colonels of Highland regiments and ladies of Octalone's lineage peering down with extreme disapproval. But Octalone looks as if he's having a ball. You can see a slightly glazed look on his face, not entirely clear what he's smoking in that hookah. Next slide. This building incidentally survives. Here is his Seal in Persian, Nazir-ud-Dawla was his title, and Nazirabad in Rajasthan to this day preserves his name, although very few people who live in Nazirabad realize it is in fact a Scots-Bostonian after whom they are named. Next slide. I'm going to run through these slides quite quickly now. So Nita, or whoever's controlling it, could we keep concentrating? This is the Mubarak Bagh, which was Octalone's wife's burial place. Here we have a dome modeled on the dome of Florence, the great Duomo in Florence, with a cross on the top. But around it is a whole forest of minarets, one of the only buildings in the world where a cross and minaret can be found side by side. This is a measure of this extraordinary multicultural world that developed, because the Brits, coming from a cold northern country, found themselves extraordinarily enamored by the civilization of India at this period and adopted it for themselves. Next slide. Here is my wife's ancestor and one of the Octalone's assistants, William Fraser. Now, just run through these slides. Here he is in London, in Edinburgh, painted by Edinburgh portrait painter. Just before he goes out, look at that snotty look of an entitled Scottish aristocrat. But look what happens when he gets to Calcutta. Next slide. Here he is. He's still got his Scottish hat on, but everything below his hat has become thoroughly Indianized. He's wearing the full Indian jama and calligraphy pens, and only his hat really remains Scottish. Next slide. We see it becomes even more intense, wearing a sort of Rowett Bal wedding outfit. Next slide. Here he is. And after that, I think we have his death mask. So many Brits of this period, next slide, please, adopted these clothes, these modes of life, these modes of living. And it's this extraordinary mixture of different worlds and this very unexpected way that the Brits of the East India Company reacted to India that is the subject of White Moguls. We're just going to race through the next few slides. Please, could I have the next one? There's William Fraser at the end of his life, his death mask next. And William Fraser's children. You can see this mixed race kids left and right. They had two names. They were one was called Mirza Fakhru and Mirza Jahangir, but they were also known as Ian and James Fraser. So they had these sort of double lives. And many of these East India Company officers had these double lives, living as Hindus or Muslims with their Hindu or Muslim wives, but coming up against reality when it came to the children and trying somehow to straddle two diverging worlds. Next slide. The main story in White Moguls is the story of James Achilles Kirkpatrick. He falls in love with, next slide, Karanisa Begum. Here he is dressed in his full Hyderabadi outfit. Next slide. And his assistant, Henry Russell, wearing his outfit. Now, these guys are posted to the what's left of the Mughal court in Hyderabad, then a vital East India Company ally against the Marathas and Tipu Sultan. Next slide. And in the middle of this delicate diplomacy, Kirkpatrick, who had taken a great liking to Mughal culture and used to write Urdu poetry, wear Indian clothes, listen to Indian music, next slide, falls in love with this girl, Karanisa Begum, who is a Persian beauty, family from Western Iran, from Shushta. And it's not entirely clear, but the book gives the best account we can of this. Karanisa becomes pregnant pretty quickly by Kirkpatrick. And when the news escapes through the Hyderabad network of midwives, next slide, the Prime Minister of Hyderabad, Shah, blackmails Kirkpatrick into becoming a double agent working for the Hyderabadis against the East India Company, which Kirkpatrick is more than willing to do because he's fallen in love with this culture, he's fallen in love with this woman, and he thinks that Marquis Wellesley, next slide, is a monster. Here is the Nizam and Shah Next slide. We just run through the next 4 or 5 slides quickly. These are the French sepoys that he manages to get out, the residency that he gets the Nizam to build for him. Next slide. Here it is today, just recently been fantastically refurbished by the World Monuments Fund. Next slide. And behind the residency is Kerenisa's Rang Mahal. So as well as living this double life himself, there are 2 separate worlds in the residency. The very British Palladian villa modelled on the White House, and the Rang Mahal where Kerenisa Begum lives with the 2 children, next slide, who are born of this marriage. And the complicating factor is Mir Alam, this man, who is the prime minister, who is Kerenisa's uncle, who is furious. And next slide, the book tells the long saga of how Kirkpatrick tried to keep his marriage secret. He told only his brother, this man, William Kirkpatrick, and that I think is the Tollygunge Club behind him, where William Kirkpatrick once lived. Next slide. And Marquis Wellesley, the elder brother of the Duke of Wellington, who did not know the whole details of Kirkpatrick's marital arrangements and the fact that he'd become a Muslim. So this whole complicated marital story which results in Hyderabad becoming a British ally, and the Nizam state becoming the largest princely state in India right up until after 1947, till the year after, when Operation Polo brings it within independent India, rests on this complicated story. So this second volume of the Company Quartet adds a little sort of social history and nuance to this story, what's going on actually in people's private lives. Next slide. We're going to keep going. This is Kirkpatrick towards the end. Keep going, please. We're going to go on to this is the children born of the marriage, Sab Alam and Sab Begum, and here she is in later in life in Torquay. And one of the most extraordinary moments of the book is when Kitty Kirkpatrick, the daughter of this marriage, discovers that her grandmother is still alive in Hyderabad and writes this letter to her. My dear grandmother, I often think of you and remember you and my dear mother. I often dream that I am with you in India and that I will see you both in the room you used to sit in. No day of my life has ever passed without my thinking of my dear mother. I can remember the veranda and the place where the tailors worked, and the place at the housetop where my mother used to let me sit down and slide. When I dream of my mother, I am such joy to have found her again that I awake, or else am pained in finding that she cannot understand the English I now speak. I can well recollect her cries when we left her, and can see now the place where she sat when we parted, and her tearing her long hair. What worlds I would give to possess one lock of that beautiful and much-loved hair. How dreadful to think that so many, many years have passed when it would have done my heart such good to think that you loved me. And when I longed to write to you and tell you these feelings I was never able to express. A letter which I'm sure would have been detained by my grandfather. And now, how wonderful it is, after 35 years, that I'm able for the first time to hear that you think of me and love me, and have thought me cold and insensible to such near, dear ties. So this is the sort of thing that's going on behind the money counting and the battles told in the Anarchy. So a bit of social history. Next, we march on to the next book, which is Return of the King, the third volume. Now, Return of the King tells the story of the maximum extent of the East India Company, when this corporation thought that it could just conquer Afghanistan. And it marches an Indian army, next slide, all the way up to Afghanistan to put back on the throne this man, Shah Shuja-ul-Mulk, who looks a bit like Gimli in The Lord of the Rings, but he is the ousted Timurid emperor of, the ousted Durrani emperor of a Timurid mother who had lost his throne. And it's a story of massive hubris, because as we know now, no one ever goes to Afghanistan and wins. Next slide. It all begins with Alexander Burnes, who encourages the East India Company to think that they could conquer Afghanistan. Next slide. And eventually this entire massive army of the Bengal army of the East India Company heads off into Afghanistan. An extraordinary, massive undertaking from Firozpur down through the Baluchi deserts, through the Bolan Pass. Next slide. Next slide, please. Nita, could we have the next slide? Through Bolan Pass, seen here. Next slide. And massively lost across the plains of Baluchistan. But eventually they find their way to Kandahar. Next slide. And manage eventually to reinstall, despite all the bandits. Next slide. Shah Shuja ul Mulk. It all, of course, ends in disaster. In the famous retreat from Kabul, when an entire Bengal army is cut up in the plains of Afghanistan. Next slide. Today, it's these wonderful gardens outside Jalalabad, and resulted in the famous painting, next slide, of Lady Butler, of the last of remnants of an army, the alleged survivor, Dr. Bryden, on his horse after the whole of the Kabul mission had been destroyed in the plains of Afghanistan. So that's the third volume of the Company Quartet, the story of this attempt, this failed attempt to include Afghanistan in the empire. And from then we lead on to the last volume, next slide, which is The Last Mogul, the story of the great uprising of 1857 and the extraordinary figure of Bahadur Shah Zafar. Next slide. Zafar, as we know, was this extraordinary artist who, despite having virtually no money and no power, produced an extraordinary cultural renaissance in Delhi that included Zork, Momin, Ghalib, and next slide. And the emperor himself was a great calligrapher. Next slide, please. Here he is as a calligrapher. Next slide. We see his extraordinary own calligraphy work. Next slide has a wonderful moleskin of his poetic verses. And even if you can't read the Urdu and the Persian, you can see just this restless energy of this man's creative work. He was a brilliant poet in 4 languages, but not the man, aged 86, to lead the great uprising against the British. He was no Netaji. Next slide. And when the uprising takes place, the sepoys, who are largely Hindu Brahmins, come to mainly to Delhi. 100,000 of the 169,000 Bengal sepoys come to Delhi and tried to put Zafar back on the throne. But the whole uprising is ill-coordinated and a disaster. And in September 1857, a new army gathered from the Sikhs in the Punjab and from the Pashtuns of what's now Waziristan, go through Kashmiri Gate, next slide, and take Delhi with hideous consequences. This is the final episode in the history of the East India Company, because such is the bloodshed, more than 100,000 innocent civilians killed, vast carnage across the plains of North India, that the East India Company is wound up by Parliament the next year. Next slide. Here is Punch cartoon showing the end of the East India Company: avarice, nepotism, blundering, and misgovernment. And there is that building, East India Company House, that we saw in the earlier slides, being in the Punch cartoon, blown from the mouth of the cannon, the horrible punishment used by the company against mutinous sepoys. So it is that in 1858, the East India Company is wound up and replaced by the British government. Finally, you have the beginning of the Raj. But the quote that I would like to end with, next slide, comes from an earlier period of history when Warren Hastings is put on trial. And the Chancellor, trying Warren Hastings for corruption, makes this speech in Westminster Hall. Corporations, he says, have neither bodies to be punished nor souls to be condemned. They therefore do as they like. So there we are. We've come to the end, I'm afraid, of the time. I'd be very happy to answer any questions on email. Nita, do we have a few extra minutes for questions? Have I run out?
I think we've run short of time and we have to move to the next session. But we have a couple of questions in the comments. So if I could send you the link, or we could ask.
Sure, I would be happy. I'd be happy to answer them. So thank you for that canter through East India Company corporate history. The story of the largest and most vicious corporation in the history of humanity, and a terrible warning today of the power of corporate greed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, William.